Why did a superpower attack one of the smallest countries in Europe? Because Stalin believed he had no choice. After watching Germany tear apart Poland in 1939, the Soviet Union panicked. Leningrad, the USSR's second-largest city, sat just 32 kilometers from the Finnish border. To Stalin, that was an open invitation for a German attack through Finland. So Moscow demanded what it called security adjustments. A chunk of land in Karelia, rights to build Soviet bases, and a lease on the Hamko Peninsula. Finland refused. They were willing to negotiate land swaps, but not allow Soviet troops into the country. To them, this wasn't security, it was a takeover. Stalin decided Finland must be forced to comply. The Red Army expected a quick parade to Helsinki, but instead of collapsing, Finland mobilized, fortified the forests, and prepared to fight on terrain and in temperatures the Soviets were completely unready for. The invasion wasn't about resources or conquest. It was about fear, paranoia, and Stalin's obsession with pushing enemies farther from his borders, even if the enemy was peaceful and tiny. And the gamble backfired spectacularly.
The Soviets thought Finland would collapse in days. Instead, they slammed straight into one of the toughest defensive lines in Europe, the Mannerheim line. Stretching across the Karelian Isthmus, this wasn't a solid wall, but a network of bunkers, trenches, hidden artillery, and natural obstacles fused into the frozen landscape. Its strength wasn't concrete, it was terrain, camouflage, and Finnish ingenuity. Entire bunkers were buried in granite. Anti-tank obstacles were carved directly from frozen earth. Machine gun nests blended so perfectly into the forest that Soviet troops walked right past them. Most importantly, the line was designed for mobile defense. The Finns didn't stand still. They struck from the flanks, vanished into the woods, and used the brutal Arctic winter as a weapon. For the Red Army, the Mannerheim line became a nightmare. Tanks bogged down in snow, infantry froze, and every breakthrough turned into a Finnish ambush. It wasn't impenetrable, but it bought Finland the most precious resource in war: time. The Mannerheim line didn't just defend a border, it defended a nation's survival and stunned a superpower that expected an easy victory.
When the Winter War began, Finland didn't have the numbers, the tanks, or the heavy artillery to match the Soviet Union. But it had something far more powerful: an army engineered for extreme winter survival. Finnish soldiers weren't just trained for cold, they lived in it. Most came from rural backgrounds, familiar with forests, skis, and Arctic conditions since childhood. To them, minus 30 degrees Celsius wasn't a crisis, it was normal. Their gear was simple, but perfectly adapted. White camouflage made them invisible in snow. Layered wool clothing kept them warm even when wet. Ski troops moved faster than Soviet vehicles, striking from nowhere and disappearing into the trees. Every Finnish unit learned how to build fires without smoke, dig snow shelters in minutes, and navigate forests where compasses failed. They could operate for days with minimal supplies, surviving on local food and incredible endurance. Meanwhile, Soviet troops wore dark uniforms, got bogged down in deep snow, and froze in trenches never designed for Arctic warfare. Finland's army didn't outgun the Red Army, it outlasted it. By mastering the cold, the Finns turned winter into their greatest ally and turned the battlefield itself against one of the world's largest militaries.
When the USSR invaded Finland in 1939, the world expected a swift Soviet victory. Instead, the Red Army stumbled into one of the most embarrassing starts of any major power in World War II. Why? Because the Red Army marched into the Winter War unprepared, poorly led, and badly equipped. First, the Great Purge had wiped out much of the Soviet officer corps. Thousands of experienced commanders were arrested, executed, or replaced with politically loyal but inexperienced officers. Strategy collapsed under fear. Second, the Red Army underestimated Finland completely. They expected a border skirmish, not a determined national defense backed by rugged forests, frozen lakes, and temperatures that could kill faster than bullets. Third, Soviet tactics were outdated. Mass infantry charges and long, vulnerable columns worked on paper, not in dense forests filled with Finnish ski troops who could strike from any direction. Then came equipment problems. Tanks that couldn't handle deep snow, troops in dark uniforms standing out against white landscapes, artillery firing blindly without proper maps, supplies freezing solid before reaching the front. Most disastrous of all, communication was chaos. Orders were slow, confusing, or ignored. Entire units marched into ambushes because nobody knew where the Finns actually were. The result? A superpower with overwhelming numbers was humiliated by a tiny nation armed with strategy, discipline, and winter mastery. The Red Army eventually adapted, but the early weeks revealed just how fragile Stalin's military really was.
In the frozen forests of Finland, one man became a nightmare for the Red Army. His enemies called him Bälä Smert, a White Death. His real name was Simo Häyhä. Häyhä wasn't a giant, a super soldier, or a myth. He was a quiet farmer, a hunter, and a member of the Finnish civil guard who knew the forests like an extension of his own body. When the Winter War began, he brought just 3 things to the front: a rifle with no scope, white camouflage, and unmatched patience. Häyhä preferred iron sights over scopes. They never glinted in the sun and never fogged in the cold. Every shot was deliberate, invisible, and final. He built snowbanks in front of him to steady his rifle and hide muzzle flash. He packed snow in his mouth so his breath wouldn't reveal his position. And he lay motionless for hours in -30°C temperatures, waiting for the Red Army to make the slightest mistake. The Soviets tried everything to kill him: artillery barrages, counter-snipers, even entire units sent to hunt him. They failed. In just 98 days, Häyhä recorded over 500 confirmed kills, the highest in history for a sniper. But the legend almost ended when he was struck in the face by an explosive bullet. He survived, scarred but alive, and became a national hero. Simo Häyhä didn't win the Winter War, but he became its most enduring symbol, a reminder that in the right hands, silence, patience, and skill can terrify an entire army.
In the Winter War, Finland didn't just fight on snow, it moved on it. And nothing terrified Soviet troops more than the sudden appearance of Finnish ski soldiers, gliding silently out of the forest like ghosts. Ski troops gave Finland something the Red Army never achieved: speed, flexibility, and total control of the terrain. While Soviet columns crawled along narrow roads, the Finns simply ignored the roads entirely. They struck from the flanks, cut supply lines, vanished into the trees, and reappeared kilometers away before the Soviets even knew what happened. These troops grew up on skis. Skiing wasn't training, it was childhood. They could cover 20 to 40 kilometers in a day, fight, then disappear without leaving tracks that could be followed for long. Their tactics were brutal and effective. Fast-moving flanking attacks, hit-and-run ambushes, encircling isolated Soviet units, and striking supply convoys deep behind enemy lines.
And in deep snow, their mobility turned Soviet formations into easy targets. Tanks bogged down, trucks froze, but Finnish troops swept across the landscape with almost supernatural speed. Ski soldiers made the Finnish army feel larger than it was, an invisible force that controlled the battlefield through mobility, surprise, and mastery of winter itself. In a war defined by ice and forests, ski troops became Finland's deadliest secret weapon.
The Soviet Union entered the Winter War with thousands of tanks, expecting them to smash through Finnish defenses. Instead, many became metal coffins stuck in snowdrifts and forests. So why did Soviet armor fail so badly? First, the terrain. The Karelian Isthmus wasn't open tank country. It was dense forest, narrow roads, frozen swamps, and snow that swallowed whole vehicles. Tanks could only move in single file along roads, perfect ambush traps for Finnish troops. Second, deep snow. Soviet tanks were heavy and had narrow tracks, sinking into snow like stones. Engines overheated, froze, or stalled. Meanwhile, Finns on skis moved freely around them, attacking from every angle. Third, poor coordination. Armor was often sent ahead of infantry, alone, lost, easy targets. Finnish soldiers used Molotov cocktails, log obstacles, and close-range strikes to disable engines, blind drivers, and force crews to abandon their vehicles. A single immobilized tank could block an entire column. Fourth, visibility and camouflage. Dark green tanks in a white landscape were impossible to hide. Finns could see them coming from kilometers away. Finally, Soviet doctrine. Stalin's purges gutted experienced tank commanders. New officers relied on rigid tactics that didn't work in forests, where every turn was a choke point and every tree was a firing position. The result? The Red Army's armored advantage melted away in the snow, while Finnish troops proved that terrain, tactics, and mobility could beat steel any day.
When Finland realized it couldn't match the Red Army's tanks with its own, it turned to something shockingly simple and devastatingly effective: the Molotov cocktail. A glass bottle filled with flammable liquid, a rag fuse, and the courage to get close enough to use it. Against Soviet armor in deep snow and narrow forest roads, it became a weapon of pure ingenuity. Finnish troops waited in the trees as tanks crawled forward, isolated from infantry support. Once a tank slowed or got stuck, a soldier would sprint out, ignite the rag, and smash the bottle onto the engine vents. The result was brutal. Flames sucked into the engine compartment, fuel lines igniting, crews blinded or suffocated, tanks forced to bail out into the freezing snow. Sometimes, several Finns attacked at once, swarming a single tank and lighting it from all sides. A burning vehicle often blocked the entire column, creating a traffic jam of armored targets. The weapon worked so well that the term Molotov cocktail was dark humor, a sarcastic Finnish response to Soviet propaganda claiming they were dropping food supplies, not bombs. Fine, the Finns joked. If Molotov gives us food, we'll give him drinks. The Molotov cocktail didn't just stop Soviet armor. It turned Finland's forests into a battlefield where courage and creativity defeated steel.
The Battle of Suomussalmi is where the Winter War's impossible story became reality.
one tiny nation destroying two entire Soviet divisions. In December 1939, the Red Army sent more than 30,000 troops deep into Finland's forests. Their goal was simple: cut the country in half. But they marched on a single narrow road through endless snow and pine, a perfect trap. Colonel Ilmar Siilasvuo and just 11,000 Finnish troops surrounded the Soviets using Motti tactics, chopping long Soviet columns into isolated pockets like firewood bundles. Cut off from each other, the Soviets froze, starved, and lost all mobility. Finnish ski troops moved freely around them, attacking supply lines, sniping officers, and striking whenever a unit weakened. Soviet tanks bogged down, trucks froze solid, communication collapsed, and the temperature plummeted to -40 degrees C. The Soviets tried to break out, but every attempt ran straight into a Finnish ambush. What began as a confident offensive turned into a nightmare of hunger, darkness, and silence broken only by Finnish rifles. By January 1940, both Soviet divisions were in ruins, over 25,000 casualties, hundreds of vehicles lost, and an entire army group wiped off the map. Finland captured so much equipment that it could rearm whole brigades. Suomussalmi wasn't just a victory. It was proof that speed, terrain mastery, and strategy could beat an army 10 times larger. A frozen forest became the graveyard of Stalin's grand plan, and the world finally understood that Finland wasn't going to surrender.
In the frozen forests of Finland, one strategy turned a tiny army into a force that could decimate a superpower: Motti tactics. Motti literally means a bundle of firewood, and that's exactly what Finnish soldiers did to Soviet columns. Long Soviet formations on narrow roads became isolated pockets, chopped into smaller, manageable units. The Finns didn't attack en masse. They didn't need to. They struck small, fast, and invisible. Ski troops hit flanks, cut supply lines, and vanished before the Soviets could respond. Once encircled, Soviet troops were trapped. No reinforcements, no supplies, no way to retreat. Cold, hunger, and relentless sniping did the rest. Tanks became useless, trucks froze, and morale crumbled. Motti tactics turned Finland's forests into a living trap. Each bundle of enemy soldiers could be picked off individually, multiplied by dozens of small attacks across the front. It was brilliant simplicity, using terrain, mobility, and patience to turn weakness into strength. The Red Army had numbers. The Finns had brains, skis, and the forest itself. And in the Winter War, that was enough to crush divisions and rewrite the rules of modern warfare.
The Winter War wasn't just fought by soldiers. Every Finn became part of the defense, and the civilian struggle was as brutal as any battlefield. As Soviet troops advanced, families fled villages and towns, dragging what little they could carry through snowdrifts and frozen forests. Homes were destroyed, crops burned, and livestock taken or killed. Hunger became a constant companion, and the bitter cold a relentless enemy. Civilians supported the war effort in every way possible. Men built defensive fortifications and Motti traps. Women sewed clothing, prepared food, and cared for the wounded. Children helped with communications, relayed messages, or gathered supplies. The winter itself was a weapon. Frostbite, snowstorms, and starvation struck without warning. Yet the Finnish population endured, improvising shelters, melting snow for water, and sharing what little they had. The resilience of civilians didn't just save lives, it sustained the army. Soldiers could fight because families protected the home front. Villages became bases, forests became cover, and communities became part of the national defense.
In the Winter War, survival wasn't just about tactics or weapons. It was about courage, endurance, and the determination of an entire people to stand against impossible odds.
In the Winter War, Finland had more than forests and skis on its side. It had the cold itself. Temperatures regularly plunged to minus 40 degrees Celsius, freezing rivers, snapping trees, and turning roads into treacherous ice tracks. For Soviet troops, unprepared for such extremes, the weather became as deadly as Finnish bullets. Frostbite, hypothermia, and frozen weapons slowed advances. Tanks and trucks bogged down or stalled. Soldiers marched in dark uniforms across endless white, their presence betrayed by every breath in the icy air. Finnish troops thrived in this environment. Layered wool clothing kept them warm even when wet. White camouflage made them invisible in snow-covered forests. Ski troops glided silently over frozen lakes and drifts, striking quickly and vanishing without a trace. The weather didn't just slow the Soviets, it shaped every tactic. Ambushes were timed to blizzards. Snow and ice created natural obstacles for advancing columns, and the psychological toll of freezing without hope broke morale faster than bullets. In Finland, winter wasn't an enemy to endure, it was a weapon. It amplified the army's strengths and magnified the weaknesses of the Red Army. In the end, the cold became one of Finland's most powerful allies, turning nature itself into a force multiplier against a much larger foe.
Finland wasn't just fighting bullets and tanks, it was fighting perception. The Winter War caught global attention. Newspapers, radio, and photographs painted a picture of a tiny, determined nation standing alone against the Soviet juggernaut. Finland became the David facing Goliath. The Finns and their allies carefully shaped this narrative. Stories of heroic ski troops and snipers like Simo Häyhä spread quickly. Images of civilians resisting invasion humanized the fight. International media coverage highlighted Soviet overreach, making Finland a symbol of resistance. Propaganda wasn't just for show, it had practical effects. Foreign volunteers arrived to help. Aid flowed in from countries like Sweden, Norway, and the United States. And more importantly, it boosted Finnish morale, reminding soldiers and civilians alike that the world was watching. Even the Soviets tried their own propaganda, calling the invasion a peacekeeping mission. But against tales of frozen forests, ambushed columns, and heroic snipers, their message fell flat. In the Winter War, winning hearts and minds mattered almost as much as winning battles. By controlling the narrative, Finland garnered sympathy, aid, and global attention, turning its underdog story into a powerful weapon against a superpower.
Though tiny and outnumbered, Finland wasn't entirely alone in the Winter War. Around the world, sympathy and solidarity translated into action. Thousands of foreign volunteers from Sweden, Norway, Denmark, and even Estonia crossed borders to fight alongside the Finns. These weren't just adventurers. Many were experienced soldiers and skiers, bringing skills that Finland desperately needed. Countries also sent material aid, rifles, ammunition, winter clothing, medical supplies, and even aircraft. Sweden, in particular, played a key role, providing both men and resources. But the support went beyond weapons and volunteers. International pressure made the world watch Stalin's aggression closely, isolating the USSR diplomatically. Finland became a symbol of courage, a tiny nation resisting a superpower, and that image rallied global attention. On the battlefield, foreign volunteers reinforced Finnish units in critical areas. Behind the lines, supplies and humanitarian aid sustained civilians and soldiers alike, allowing Finland to fight longer and smarter than many expected. In a war dominated by numbers and firepower, international solidarity gave Finland an edge. a reminder that even the smallest nations can survive when the world sees their courage.
When Stalin ordered the invasion of Finland in 1939, he expected a quick, easy victory. Instead, he faced a harsh lesson in underestimating the human and environmental factors of war. First, he assumed Finland would surrender immediately. The Soviets expected a few days of minor skirmishes. Instead, they encountered a nation united, highly motivated to defend its homeland at all costs. Second, he ignored the terrain and climate. Finnish forests, frozen lakes, and snow-covered landscapes made massed Soviet formations slow, vulnerable, and easy to ambush. Temperatures of -30 degrees Celsius to -40 degrees Celsius became weapons in the hands of Finnish troops trained for winter survival. Third, Stalin underestimated Finnish tactics. The Red Army relied on rigid doctrines, frontal assaults, long columns, and mechanized units, which were perfectly countered by Motti tactics, ski troops, and sniper ambushes. Innovation, speed, and local knowledge turned the Soviet strengths into weaknesses. Finally, he misjudged morale. Soviet soldiers suffered from fear, poor leadership, and harsh conditions, while Finnish soldiers and civilians fought with unbreakable resolve. The result? Massive Soviet casualties, failed offensives, and a global embarrassment for Stalin. In the Winter War, Stalin learned that numbers alone cannot guarantee victory, and that even a superpower can falter when it underestimates its opponent.
The Karelian Isthmus was Finland's front line, a narrow, frozen corridor between Lake Ladoga and the Gulf of Finland. For the Soviets, it was the quickest path to Helsinki. For the Finns, it was the nation's last line of defense. Finnish soldiers turned the isthmus into a fortress. Rivers were dammed, bunkers were dug into granite, and every tree and rock became part of the defensive network. Snow-covered trenches and cleverly camouflaged machine gun nests allowed small units to hold ground against overwhelming odds. Soviet tanks and infantry charged again and again, expecting numbers to prevail. Time and again, they were ambushed, bogged down, and broken apart by the Finns' intimate knowledge of the terrain. Ski troops struck supply lines, snipers picked off officers, Molotov cocktails destroyed immobilized tanks, and every Finnish soldier knew that retreat was not an option. Their homeland depended on their resolve. The defense of the Karelian Isthmus slowed the Soviet advance for months, bought critical time, and showcased the power of preparation, terrain mastery, and morale. Even though the Soviets eventually breached parts of the line, the isthmus became a symbol of Finnish determination, proving that courage and ingenuity could hold off a superpower, at least for a time.
The Winter War wasn't just fought on frozen forests and snow-covered roads. It also played out in the skies and on the waters of the Gulf of Finland. One of the most daring Finnish operations targeted the Soviet battleship Marat, a massive vessel that posed a serious threat to coastal defenses and supply lines. On December 10, 1939, Finnish bombers took to the air. The plan was precise: hit the battleship in shallow waters near Helsinki before it could react. Using small, maneuverable aircraft and expert pilots, the Finns dropped bombs with uncanny accuracy, despite freezing temperatures, strong winds, and heavy anti-aircraft fire. A direct hit detonated the Marat's magazines. Explosions tore through the ship, sinking it and removing a major Soviet naval threat from the Gulf. Casualties were significant, and the psychological impact on the Red Navy was profound. The attack demonstrated that small forces, well-trained and bold, could strike where larger armies thought themselves safe.
Even in a war dominated by the Soviet Union's size and numbers, Finnish air operations proved precision, courage, and planning could level the playing field. The sinking of the Marat became a legendary moment in the Winter War, a reminder that strategy and audacity could defeat even the largest weapons of war.
The Soviets entered the Winter War expecting to dominate the skies, but the Finnish Air Force had other plans. First, numbers didn't guarantee success. The Red Air Force had more planes, but many were poorly maintained, flown by inexperienced pilots, and hampered by harsh winter conditions. Engines froze, instruments failed, and navigation was nearly impossible in heavy snow and low visibility. Second, Finland's terrain worked against them. Dense forests, frozen lakes, and narrow valleys made bombing runs tricky and dangerous. Soviet bombers struggled to hit small, camouflaged targets like villages, bunkers, and supply lines. Third, Finnish pilots were highly skilled and used hit-and-run tactics. They flew light, maneuverable planes, striking Soviet formations quickly before disappearing behind forests or into clouds. Surprise and agility allowed Finland to maximize damage while minimizing losses. Finally, morale and leadership were weak. Stalin's purges had removed experienced officers, and rigid Soviet strategies couldn't adapt to Finland's unconventional warfare. Pilots often flew missions without proper intelligence or support. The result? Despite massive numbers, the Red Air Force failed to provide decisive support. Finnish forces remained mobile, supply lines intact, and morale high, proving that even overwhelming air power could be neutralized by terrain, skill, and winter itself.
In the Winter War, Finland turned its greatest weakness, being outnumbered, into an advantage. The secret? Forests, snow, and stealth. Finnish snipers, like Simo Häyhä, used the forests to strike unseen. They blended perfectly with the snow, waited for hours in freezing silence, and picked off Soviet officers and soldiers one by one. Every shot disrupted command and spread fear. Scouts moved ahead of the main force, mapping enemy positions, cutting supply lines, and guiding ski troops for precise ambushes. Their intimate knowledge of the terrain made Soviet movement predictable and deadly. Ambushes were the Finnish army's bread and butter. Soviet columns stuck to narrow roads through forests, ideal for surprise attacks. A few dozen Finnish soldiers could stop an entire battalion, immobilize tanks, and vanish before reinforcements arrived. Together, snipers, scouts, and ambushers created a ghostly, omnipresent threat. The Red Army faced enemies they could rarely see, often not until it was too late. In the Winter War, the forests weren't just cover, they were a weapon. After weeks of humiliating defeats, the Red Army finally began learning from its failures in the Winter War. Stalin's forces had underestimated terrain, weather, and Finnish tactics, but 1940 brought adaptation and reorganization. Officers were retrained, new winter uniforms issued, and better coordination between infantry, artillery, and tanks implemented. The Soviets began to move more cautiously. Columns were broken into smaller units, reconnaissance improved, and engineers cleared forests and roads for armor. Even artillery and air support were integrated more effectively, softening Finnish defenses before attacks. They still struggled with morale and winter conditions, but lessons were learned quickly. By February and March, Soviet attacks became more methodical, less predictable, and deadlier than before, forcing Finnish troops to fight smarter.
The Red Army's adaptation didn't erase Finnish ingenuity, but it leveled the playing field enough to finally push through some defensive lines. The Winter War had been a wake-up call. Even a superpower could stumble, but with rapid learning, mistakes could be turned into future strength.
Viipuri, Finland's second-largest city, became the symbol of the nation's struggle in the Winter War. By late February 1940, after months of relentless fighting, the Soviet war machine began to overwhelm Finnish defenses. Artillery bombardments flattened fortifications, and continuous assaults exhausted troops already weakened by winter and supply shortages. Despite heroic resistance and clever tactics, the Finns faced an impossible choice: fight to the last man in the city or retreat to save their army. They chose survival. Soviet forces entered Viipuri, marking a critical turning point. The city's fall wasn't just a military loss, it was a psychological blow. Finnish forces had fought brilliantly, but even ingenuity, courage, and winter mastery had limits against sheer numbers and relentless pressure. Yet, the retreat wasn't defeat. Finnish forces regrouped, fortified other lines, and continued to resist, buying time for diplomacy and preserving the army for future battles. The fall of Viipuri highlighted the harsh reality of the Winter War. Small nations could fight bravely, but sometimes survival meant ceding ground while maintaining the will to continue the fight.
On March 12, 1940, the Winter War officially ended with the Moscow Peace Treaty. Finland had survived an invasion by the world's second-largest army, but the cost was high. The treaty forced Finland to cede 11% of its territory, including parts of Karelia, Viipuri, and the Karelian Isthmus. Hundreds of thousands of Finns were displaced, losing homes, farms, and livelihoods. On paper, the Soviets achieved their goal. They gained land and pushed their borders farther from Leningrad. But the victory came at a staggering cost: over 200,000 Soviet casualties, destroyed morale, and exposed weaknesses in their military. Finland, meanwhile, kept its independence. Its army remained intact, its spirit unbroken, and the world saw a tiny nation stand up to a superpower and survive. So who really won? The Soviets gained territory, yes, but Finland gained prestige, experience, and a legend of resistance that would echo for generations. The Moscow Peace Treaty ended the fighting, but it didn't end the legacy of courage that Finland had forged in the snow.
The Winter War was a harsh wake-up call for Stalin. The Red Army's early failures exposed weaknesses that no one in Moscow could ignore. Soviet tactics relied on numbers and brute force, but Finland proved that terrain, weather, and clever strategy could nullify numerical superiority. The purges that had removed experienced officers also left the army unprepared for modern, flexible warfare. After the Winter War, Stalin began major reforms, rebuilding the officer corps with more competent leaders, updating tactics to include better coordination between infantry, armor, and artillery, and emphasizing winter warfare training and logistical planning. These lessons influenced the Soviet approach in World War II. When Hitler invaded in 1941, the Red Army's survival and eventual counteroffensives were shaped by the bitter experience gained in Finland. The Winter War showed Stalin that even a superpower could stumble, but it also taught him how to prevent that from happening again. In other words, Finland didn't just resist, it forced the Soviet Union to adapt, and that adaptation would echo through the Eastern Front.
The Winter War wasn't just a battle between Finland and the Soviet Union. It became a lesson for the world. Tiny Finland, outnumbered and outgunned, showed that strategy, terrain mastery, and morale could overcome even the largest armies. Across Europe, small nations watched closely. Norway, the Baltic states, and others realized that resistance was possible, that surrender wasn't inevitable. Finland's courage also sparked international sympathy, encouraging volunteers and humanitarian aid. Their story circulated in newspapers, inspiring military planners and civilians alike to rethink defense strategies. Even in exile or under threat, leaders of small nations saw that ingenuity, mobility, and national unity could buy time, save lives, and make a statement against aggression. While Finland eventually ceded territory, the legacy of resistance sent a clear message: being small doesn't mean being powerless. In the Winter War, courage became contagious, and Finland became a symbol of defiance for the weak against the strong.
The Winter War has inspired countless stories, but many aren't entirely true. Myth 1. Finland won the war. Reality: Finland survived, but at great cost, ceding territory and losing tens of thousands of lives. Survival was a victory, but not a complete military triumph. Myth 2. The Red Army was incompetent. Reality: early Soviet failures were serious, but they quickly adapted. By the end of the war, the Red Army had learned valuable lessons that would shape World War II. Myth 3. Finland relied solely on snipers and ski troops. Reality: while legendary figures like Simo Häyhä were crucial, Finland's success depended on fortifications, planning, and civilian support, a whole-of-nation effort. Myth 4. Weather alone won the war. Reality: cold was a factor, but Finnish strategy, mobility, and morale were far more decisive. Winter was a force multiplier, not a replacement for tactics. The Winter War wasn't just a story of David versus Goliath. It was complex, brutal, and nuanced. And understanding it requires separating legend from reality.
The Winter War inflicted massive losses on both sides, but Soviet casualty figures remain debated. Official Soviet reports claimed around 48,000 dead, 150,000 wounded, and 25,000 missing. Yet historians suggest the real toll was much higher, possibly over 200,000 casualties, including frostbite, disease, and soldiers lost in forests. Why the discrepancy? Stalin wanted to downplay failures. Early defeats embarrassed the Red Army, and publicizing true losses could undermine morale and political authority. The Finns, meanwhile, reported roughly 25,000 casualties, far fewer, but still significant for a small nation defending against a superpower. Ultimately, the numbers show a crucial point. Sheer size didn't guarantee success. Even the world's second-largest army suffered devastating losses against a determined, well-prepared enemy. In the Winter War, statistics tell only part of the story. Courage, tactics, and environment mattered as much as bullets and bombs.
The Winter War was a battle of strategy, skill, and equipment. The Soviets entered with tanks, artillery, and aircraft, expecting sheer firepower to overwhelm Finland. But many weapons struggled in the cold. Engines froze, guns jammed, and heavy armor sank in snow. Troops often marched with insufficient winter gear, suffering frostbite and exhaustion. Finnish forces had far fewer heavy weapons, but they were optimized for survival and mobility. Mosin Nagant rifles and light machine guns were reliable in freezing conditions. Ski troops and small units used Molotov cocktails to disable tanks. White camouflage, snowshoes, and skis gave Finnish soldiers speed and invisibility. The result? The Soviets had quantity, Finland had quality in context. Well-used, simple gear often beats superior but unwieldy machines. The war proved that adaptation to terrain and conditions often mattered more than sheer firepower. In the snow and forests of Finland, ingenuity often outweighed artillery, proving that weapons are only as effective as the hands that wield them.
Marshal Carl Gustaf Emil Mannerheim wasn't just Finland's military leader. He was the symbol of national resistance during the Winter War. Mannerheim combined strategic brilliance with deep understanding of Finnish terrain and society. He knew when to fight, when to retreat, and how to use forests, lakes, and snow to the army's advantage. His leadership turned small, outnumbered forces into a resilient, disciplined army. Beyond tactics, Mannerheim inspired confidence. Soldiers trusted his decisions, civilians supported his strategies, and Finland's international reputation benefited from his steady hand. His legacy wasn't just winning battles, it was showing that leadership, foresight, and national unity could allow a small country to survive against a superpower. Even decades later, Mannerheim remains a symbol of courage, adaptability, and resilience, proving that a great leader can shape both the outcome of war and the spirit of a nation.
The Winter War left a deep mark on both Finland and the Soviet Union, and its lessons rippled into World War II's Eastern Front. The Red Army's failures against Finland exposed weaknesses, poor leadership, rigid tactics, and vulnerability to winter warfare. After 1940, Stalin implemented reforms, retraining officers, improving coordination between infantry, armor, and artillery, and preparing for harsh conditions. When Hitler launched Operation Barbarossa in 1941, the Soviets were better prepared. Winter survival skills, mobile defense strategies, and lessons in morale management, all honed in Finland, helped the Red Army endure the early months of the German invasion. The Winter War also influenced German strategy. Observing Finland's defense showed that even small nations could slow a superpower with terrain, mobility, and determination, a warning that shaped German plans in the north and east. In short, Finland's courage didn't just preserve its own sovereignty, it reshaped the strategies of the armies that would fight across the Eastern Front, leaving an enduring mark on WW2.
Decades later, the Winter War remains a case study in military brilliance against overwhelming odds. Analysts study Finland's use of Motti tactics, breaking enemy columns into manageable pockets, ski troops and mobility, striking quickly and vanishing, terrain mastery, turning forests, lakes, and snow into defensive weapons, and civilian support and morale, ensuring the army and population functioned as one. Even modern militaries recognize that numbers alone don't win wars. Finland showed how innovation, preparation, and adaptability could overcome a superpower. From NATO exercises to academic research, the Winter War teaches lessons in asymmetric warfare, winter operations, and leadership under extreme conditions. Finland's defense isn't just history, it's a blueprint for how small, determined forces can challenge giants, and why the Winter War continues to fascinate military minds around the world.